Welcome, everyone. Apologies for the slight delay. It's our common feature to know a lot about EU law and policy and very little about anything that involves technology and computers. On behalf of the Institute for European Studies and the Jean Monnet Center on EU Emergencies, thank you for joining us today on site, but also online for what is our second roundtable today on the topic of the EU's Preparedness Union and its promises and pitfalls. This roundtable is part of a broader Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, as I said, on EU emergencies, which just kick-started its activities in November of last year. We're very excited about the 3 years to come of teaching, research, and outreach activities such as this one, but also cultural events and others. It is a project that was put together by our colleague Denis Douet that is here today and brings together a team of 10 research, teaching staff, administrative staff, all coming to it from very different angles with their own unique expertise on aspects such on 5 different axes, from rights and values, climate and the environment, asylum and migration, global Europe, and also democracy and voices, to look from all these different angles of expertise at the EU's response to emergencies within and beyond the EU. If you're interested in our activities, which I hope you are, I strongly invite you to visit our website, which is EUMERGENCIES.eu. If I can actually show it to you here. I cannot, because nothing works. Et voilà. Slight delay, EUMERGENCIES.eu. Please visit to see our accompanying teaching activities, outreach activities, and also exciting research. We really invite you to join all our events, which brings us to today's roundtable on Preparedness Union. On the 26th of March of 2025, the European Commission, together with the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, put forward the strategy called a Preparedness Union. And it was a strategy pitched against rather dark geopolitical times versus war of aggression against Ukraine, cyber attacks, disinformation and misinformation, interference with EU democracy, and much more. And it is part of a broader emergency narrative that we have already seen in von der Leyen's speech, for instance, in 2024, before the European Parliament, on strengthening the European defense in a volatile geopolitical landscape, or the famous State of the Union address of last year that started with the words, "Europe is in a fight." The Preparedness Union strategy is arguably also part of and parcel of this narrative. And its aim, ultimately, is to create, in the strategy's word, a secure and resilient union that is capable of withstanding all threats and all hazards. Now, preparedness is not really defined in the strategy, so I would venture my definition, which is this act of putting in place and having in place tools and structures required to prevent and, if needed, to respond to threats and hazards, whatever these may be, but also, one could argue, the psychological predisposition or fortitude to anticipate and to manage a lot of these threats and hazards. The strategy is put forward as a way to address 3 main shortcomings in EU's crisis management: the fact that it is reactive, that it is fragmented, and it is chronically underfunded. It puts forward 63 different actions, 30 of which are foreseen as key actions under 7 main topics, running from foresight and anticipation to public-private and also civil-military cooperation and resilience through external partnerships. And most importantly, it is put forward as an all-in approach, which means all hazards, whole of government, and whole of society. Echoing somewhat this need to bring forward the whole of society, including academia, civil society, and practitioners, it is our great honor to have here today as our speakers Professor Federico Casolari from the University of Bologna, full professor of EU law and dean of the School of Law of the University of Bologna, and a leading expert when it comes to international and particularly EU disaster law, as well as Jean-Louis de Brouwer, who is now a director of European Affairs program at the Egmont Institute, but has joined the Egmont after a long-standing career at the European Commission, not only dealing with matters at DG Justice and then DG Employment, but particularly important for today's discussion, a long-standing experience dealing with humanitarian aid operations and policy at DG ECHO. And last but definitely not least, Miriam Alberena, who is a disaster management and disaster law officer at the Red Cross EU office, an office that represents 27 EU member states' national Red Cross societies in the EU, but as well the Norwegian and the Icelandic Red Cross and the International Federation of the Red Cross. I pitched forward a somewhat of a different format for today's discussion, different as in it's not going to be our standard academic interaction. I challenge the speakers to answer each, in turn, 3 minutes max, a set of 3 questions. They're also allowed, thanks to Federico's kind suggestion, a 1 to 2 minute reaction at the end to interact with each other's comments before we open the floor to actually your own questions and answers. This is somewhat of a structured format. I will keep the time, but it's also supposed to be a somewhat informal dialogue and conversation on such a pressing theme. The questions are as follows. And then I will pass the floor respectfully just to present them to you. The idea is to ask to what extent actually does the strategy respond to these preparedness shortcomings? So what promises does it actually put forward? Where does it fall short? What are its pitfalls? And what role should or do EU institutions actually play in promoting what is called a paradigm shift, this new needed mindset or mentality of preparedness in the EU? In preparing their reflections, the speakers have also been asked to reflect on what we believe to be 3 tensions of the strategy. Temporal tension, in the sense that perhaps preparedness is no longer a short-sighted or short-timed approach in the EU, but something that has become somewhat more systemic, structural and systemic. A competence tension between the EU and its member states, but also between EU institutions when it comes to this area of preparedness. And finally, a resource tension, i.e. we have all these things to do and how on earth will we fund them? On this note, I will start with the first question and I will address it then to Federico. Federico, to what extent actually then does the strategy in your view, and namely from this more legal perspective, actually respond and address de facto preparedness shortcomings in the Union?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So first of all, let me thank Teresa for this kind invitation. It's really nice to be with you today. And I directly go to the answer to the question. From a legal perspective, in particular, I'd like to try to stress the positive, let's say, elements coming from this strategy in the context of the EU constitutional legal framework, which is in a way my main area of expertise. And to make a long story short, I think that the most important and innovative perspective which has been introduced by the strategy is to introduce an holistic approach towards preparedness in large terms. So the idea is to make the need to be able to be prepared facing emergencies, risks, hazards, to make this attitude a structural attitude of the European Union and the member states, and transforming preparedness as a sort of horizontal clause which is transversal to all the competences of the European Union. We already have in EU law, in particular EU primary law, some horizontal clauses, such as the protection of the environment or the protection of human health. These elements shall be taken into consideration in all the policies of the European Union. Well, the idea, or at least this seems to be, let's say, the fil rouge of this strategy, is to make preparedness a sort of horizontal element that must be taken into consideration by all the EU institutions and member states in elaborating concrete actions in all the policies of the European Union. And in a way, this is positive in order to try to have a coherent approach and in order to overcome the obstacles coming from the actual state of the art of the competences of the European Union. We know that there are some soft competences that can be relevant when a disaster affects some EU countries, or when you have cross-border health emergency. The competences that the Union may, in this respect, may trigger are in a way soft, so the Union cannot set aside the action of member states. Well, to have this horizontal dimension can try to breach all the other sides of action of the European Union and to breach the supranational dimension with the national one, creating a global and coherent framework. So I would say this is, from a legal point of view, the most important promising element.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for having invited me to participate into this panel discussion. I will try to answer your question. No, I will not answer your question, Teresa, by making references to three of general concerns. The first one, this is another area where the EU is venturing, although this is none of its business. If you look at, I would say, not the big picture, but I would say recent history, you can see that the EU as an institutional construction actually took off in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was the area of Saint-Jacques-de-Lors. That is to say that the EU took off at the end of the previous era of power politics. We are entering now in a new area of power politics, and this is none of the EU business as it stands. Number two, you have to relate or to attach the preparedness concept and the preparedness strategy to a broader concept of protection that you can see, or a protection strategy or concept, I don't know whether I can use the word strategy, that you can see unfolding by connecting four different Commission policy papers. The white paper on defense, the EU preparedness strategy, the one that we are discussing today, the EU strategy on internal security, and the democracy shield. The four are interconnected. If you read this communication, they relate to each other. And the pretense of the Commission is to propose a set of actions and or policies which aim all at enhancing the protection of the EU, its member states, and its citizens. Third, you referred to my past. Yes, indeed, I spent 6 years in DG ECHO, and I saw the roots, or I saw this concept progressively being elaborated by my colleagues dealing with the civil protection mechanism. It illustrates what some of you might have who are interested in EU politics or EU decision-making or EU processes. It illustrates what you could call the bureaucracy agency. This is a concept, an idea which was largely nurtured by the EU bureaucracy, building upon its experience in developing and managing successfully the EU civil protection mechanism, and of course, drawing the consequences of a series of external shocks. The most visible, it was visible because it entered into all our daily life, but the most spectacular one being the pandemic. We have also to bear in mind that one important dimension of this strategy is, of course, has to do with health. The two are interrelated, but we can come back on that later.
Many thanks. Thank you. I'll join my co-panelists on thanking Teresa and the rest of the university for having us here. And I'll jump directly to the answer with a little bit of a slightly more positive approach to the Preparedness Union Strategy. Because there are 2 points that are particularly interested from a practitioner perspective. The first one is that the Preparedness Union Strategy identifies very well who needs to be involved in terms of preparedness, and second, at what level. In my presentation, we've heard a lot of Red Cross, and that was exactly the way I explained it to the members of my office. It's a cross. We need to identify who is in line, who is pre-positioned to answer, and at what level. And if it's an European, if it's a national, and if it's a regional and even municipal. This jump down the ladder between the national and the regional is essential, especially considering the safe protection systems that exist in different countries. I'm myself from Spain, in which the national safe protection capacities are held within the regions. So this understanding is essential. The fact that it includes citizens at the core, it's also a very important point that features very strongly on the strategy. This is not a new element. In previous pieces of policy, we had already the Union Disaster Resilience Goals that pre-identified citizens that are out of the system. We can talk about tourists, for instance, that are at the time not necessarily within the system, but also labor workers. Now, from the Red Cross perspective, this is very interesting, so that no one is left behind. Perhaps a critique is to understand who needs to be considered and what is this element of vulnerability that needs to be better accounted for. And I'm also looking at my colleagues. We need to move to the next question. So just to be very precise, the fact that this takes place locally and considering citizens in the center is also essential in terms of operations. We were mentioning before this Union Safe Protection Mechanism that in terms of operations, they always communicate with national safe protection authorities, which mean capitals. If we take, for instance, the example of the 2024 tropical cyclone Chido in Mayotte, which is part of the French overseas territories, in practical terms, in terms of operation, it means that negotiations go to some extent through Paris, which doesn't make sense in terms of deploying teams, and having a granular understanding of who's affected on the ground and how we can better respond. So this element of having some agency to the citizens to bring preparedness from a general concept to something that is concrete to the household and also the communities on the ground is essential, particularly knowing that disaster no administrative borders. I'll let it there.
Thank you very much, namely for actually some of you not even expending all of your time. We had some views on the positive, so the horizontal dimension, the clarity on the what and the how, and the approach to the citizens. Less so from Jean-Louis de Brouwer, more concerns, namely on competence, which brings us actually to our second question, which is then, where does the strategy actually fall short? What are its pitfalls in your view?
Yeah, I tried to be positive in answering to the first question, but now I have to stress some negative elements, starting from the lack of clarity. When you have a strategy, of course, the strategy will be general by definition, but it must be precise in defining the scope. And, well, this is not completely clear. We must be prepared with regard to what? Regard to natural disasters, with regard to hazards, to crises, to shocks, to emergencies. This is not completely clear. Or better, all these elements are put together into the strategy, making a blurred, so to speak, conceptualization of threats that the Union should face. And these, let's say, in a way, goes back to another strategic dimension of the European Union, which is the so-called strategic autonomy of the Union, the capacity of the Union to become autonomous, to be capable to protect itself, its values, and the interests of the Union and the member states against hybrid threats, against threats coming from abroad. But this blurring conceptualization, of course, makes it difficult to identify the competences that the Union may trigger and to identify the instruments that may be deployed in this respect. So we have a very gray zone, a very gray area where this strategy, as was mentioned before, must be connected to other strategic documents, creating a fragmented strategic scenario where it's not completely clear what we are talking about. Of course, the strategy identifies the priorities. Priorities are democracy, the internal market, the protection of internal market, the protection of environment, and the strategic autonomy of the European Union. But they are put together, and it's not completely clear how the Union should deal with all these challenges. The lack of clarity is also related to the fact that, as Teresa was mentioning at the very beginning, we don't have a definition of preparedness, which is quite strange. We have a preparedness strategy, so as a lawyer, you know, lawyers need definitions to identify the scope, right? So as a lawyer, I expected to have a very beginning of a strategy, a definition of what preparedness is. And there is no definition. And preparedness is also related to resilience, to intergenerational resilience, which is something in disaster law, which is more related to a situation where the disaster actually affected the country or the area, and you have to react. So we are speaking about being prepared, or we are speaking about reacting to threats or disasters. See, so the fact that there is no clarity in this respect makes difficult the operationalization of the instrument. And this is, to me, the most negative point of this document.
Right. Maybe I would like to somewhat correct the presentation of the way my initial intervention could have been understood. I'm neither critical nor pessimistic. I'm prudent. Because we face there another major risk of delivery gap. It has been a common feature. I've been serving the Commission for a too long time, and I've been confronted to that syndrome time and again, where the Commission and or the EU announces and does not deliver. You said it yourself, Teresa. I mean, there are 63 actions foreseen in that strategy. I call that a Christmas tree. And I don't even venture into the issue of competences. So that's the reason why I think that we should be very, very, very prudent in approaching this strategy and understanding what it could do and how it could deliver. What is missing? Very easy to make the inventory. Read the new regulation proposal for a regulation enhancing the EU civil protection mechanism, which was tabled by the Commission in late spring of last year, if my memory is correct. You read that and you see everything that is missing nowadays to actually trigger the implementation of that strategy, ranging from structure, decision mechanism process, and by the way, financing. I mean, there I would say for at least the Commission is proposing to the Council and the Member State to put their money where their mouth is, because after all, they foresee an envelope of more than 10 billion euro in the next multi-annual financial framework to support the implementation of that strategy. So, I mean, the inventory of what is lacking is to be seen in the EU CPM draft regulation, which, by the way, raises major problem concerning the legal basis that has been identified by the Commission. So where does that lead me to? I would say, and that's exactly in line with the example that you gave, the main, the most positive consequences of such a paper is that it opens a conversation. It opens a conversation, and it can make people or organizations think about what it means, what preparedness means. Well, by the way, I wonder how you translate preparedness respectively in Italian or in Spanish, because I don't know how to translate that in French. But that's another example. And sorry, I'm just above my 3 minutes. Let me take an example. 2 2 months ago, the Belgian Business Federation organized a whole afternoon dedicated to its membership under the concept Be Ready. It was a very interesting approach. I mean, they had triggered a poll amongst Belgian companies, big, middle-sized, small companies, about their assessment of their risk assessment. What are the main risks and what are the main threats you think your business is confronted or could be confronted with? On that basis, they have identified 5 or 6 main risks, and they have organized the whole afternoon with experts explaining to their constituency how these risks could be either prevented or mitigated. This was clearly triggered by a paper like this one. And so that's the example of what I said. It is initiating a conversation, but its implementation will take an awful lot of time.
Many thanks. And actually, just to react very quickly, in one of the discussions that we had with the German Red Cross specifically, they were mentioning that there is no glory in preparedness, and that's one of the reasons why it is very difficult to sell it to governments and to sell it to very specific constituencies in whenever you have you're discussing budget. It's so much flashy when you have uniforms and you know, planes that are flying all over the place, whereas preparedness is a little bit more a little bit more shy, let's say. Mm-hmm. To the question on to what extent the strategy falls short, I will be very concrete. It lacks IHL. There is this principle that Teresa is mentioning, was mentioning at the very beginning, this Hall of Hazards approach, that ultimately means putting together disasters and crises that are of different kinds and that are therefore regulated differently. If we oversimplify, we might be talking about climate-related disasters, public health emergencies, and armed conflict. This, in terms of, again, operations are extremely distinct, and the fact that we're blurring lines is not only a little bit messy for lawyers when they look at different definitions and different legal frameworks, but also in terms of operations. There is this specific point in the Preparedness Union Strategy to talk about dual use of infrastructure. And I want to bring for your attention one example that is coming from Ukraine. In there, the specific dual use that has been used was by electricity transport. We're talking about railway bridges that are naturally considered for both civilian use and also military one. As such, they have been attacked. They have been considered a legit military objective. And eventually, this has impaired the functioning of hospitals, not only the military ones, but also the civilians ones, had disrupted medical supply chains and impeded ultimately humanitarian access for the population. So that brings very difficult legal questions that I see colleagues from the ICC in the audience that would be difficult to bring forth. And eventually it also create and disrupt the compliance with the principle of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack. So this is the very first and the very first point in which civilians would be affected. The second is something that I've called the operational fitness. There is, by the time there was some recommendations were brought forth, I had members from my office, specific national societies that were talking to me, saying we have a roundtable at the domestic level, and we have it with two ministries. One, the specific Ministry of Civil Defense, which is, by the time you talk about civil defense, you're talking about the Ministry of Defense, which has different competences, different actors, and they have different command and control systems. On the other hand, you have the civil protection. In non-conflict situation, whenever there is a flash flood, you're going to be guided by a whole different set of legal frameworks, but also roles and systems. So there is something that we could identify and pre-identify is this a lack of understanding of how this whole of society approach would unfold by the time it needs to be operationalized in practice. There is this fragmentation that happens in different member states that needs to be considered. Having said that, we recognize that it's false outside of the strategy, that it is something that does not necessarily account for the competence that is foreseen in the treaties for the civil protection or for the health emergencies, regardless of certain regulation of cross-border hazards. But we would have liked a little bit more of an understanding of operation, both in terms of cross-border movement of personnel, professional qualifications, liability, protection of volunteers by the time they would respond. So there is a whole set of practicalities that need to be considered, and this has been put for sure to the push towards a member state conversation. But we would have appreciated a little bit more of a general, down-to-earth understanding of how the recommendations would play out.
Much. I think there was already quite rich in terms of discussion, which would bring us to our last round of questions before we still have some degree of interaction and reaction by each of you, which is this idea that seems to permeate the strategy, that we are at the cusp or in a desperate need for a paradigm shift, in the strategy's words, towards creating a mindset that fosters a culture of preparedness and resilience. My question to you, therefore, is what role should EU institutions be playing in transforming and fostering this change of mindset and culture in Europe towards a preparedness mindset, whatever that might be? Good luck.
Yeah, it's not easy to answer to this question, in particular from a legal point of view, I must say. What I can say is that in a way we already have a shift at EU level when it comes to security issues, so to speak. The strategic autonomy doctrine I mentioned before, in a way, has reshaped the way in which the institutions exploit some legal basis, the internal market legal basis, the common commercial policy legal basis, and also Article 122, which is the legal basis used for Next Generation EU and now for SAFE. So there is a shift in the way in which the institutions and the legislator, the supranational legislator, is interpreting its role in order to make possible to introduce tools and instruments to protect or to try to protect some interests of the European Union against external threats. Of course, the Union can do what was mentioned by Jean-Louis, so make the other actors, including private actors, aware of the fact that this is something that must be discussed, that must enter into the policy making of the big companies and the policy making of member states. So the fact to elaborate a supranational strategy may trigger a debate at European level, so to speak, including private subjects, private actors that may play a role in this respect. And then, of course, what the Union could do is what the Union can do in a situation of emergency or crisis, try to coordinate the action of different actors. This is something that the Union has tried to do in a recent crisis. If you consider the answer reaction to COVID-19, for instance, the European Commission played a strong coordination role reinterpreting its action. This was also possible thanks to the member states' acceptance of this change in the attitude of EU Commission. So this could be something that could be used also for future by the European Commission in particular, in order to trigger or to strengthen this paradigm shift that in reality is already ongoing in a way. Of course, in order to do things, in order to implement policies, you need money. So something that should be in a way explored a bit more, and using soft words, but in reality, we should say that something that should completely reinterpreted, it's the budgetary dimension of this strategy. There's now there are proposals related to the multi-annual financial framework that will start in 2028. There is the proposal to merge, in particular, the budget for the civil protection action of the Union with the budget for cross-border health emergencies. So a single budget for these two pillars of EU disaster law, EU emergency law, but this is not sufficient at all. So we should try to, let's say, think about the need to reinterpret globally the way in which the budget of the Union is elaborated in order to give the possibility to have concrete actions and not only nice words. So in order to deliver and not only to say things.
Okay, so if the question is what role do or should the EU institution play in promoting a paradigm shift, I would say the short answer is the role that the member states will then let them play. This is entirely in the hands of the member states. And that is going to be, and we might elaborate on that later on, this is going to be one of the main challenges for the EU institutions in the years to come, if they stick to the view that they should implement the preparedness strategy. That's to say, to walk on the thin line between what they can do and what member states see are their prerogatives. All the more than there are, visible divergence between member states when it comes to the understanding of preparedness needs. Clearly, the Nordics are much more advanced than the other one. And for me, the Nordics do stop at the Netherlands and Germany, and they do not cross the Belgian border. So you have there, in many of these member states, the roots of a culture of preparedness, and it will be much easier for them to engage, either at state level or collectively. I see something like a coalition of the willing in the making around that, into a common approach or a joined-up approach of preparedness. You said very rightly that preparedness is a very difficult concept to sell to states and societies. It's even more difficult to sell to individuals, because how do you, nurture a culture of preparedness while not scaring, in a way, the people? Scare is a major driver of action for everybody. Societies, institutes. Why did we engage into mitigating the consequences of COVID together? Because we were deadly scared. That's what triggered. So we should not underestimate this factor. So as long as people are scared, there is very little lever that we can use to make them prepare themselves. Maybe, well, okay, this is a very bad joke. Some of you might know one of the most famous worldwide Belgian figures, Jean-Claude Van Damme. And you might have heard that Jean-Claude Van Damme regularly insisted on the needs of being aware. It is about that, being aware, understanding that there are risks in our environment, individual or collective environment, and that we can take action in, I would say, either preventing these risks or mitigating their consequences, which are two different concepts. One last comparison, which could be relevant. We supported yesterday the organization by the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs of a conference on fragility, which is a key concern in implementing the humanitarian aid agenda nowadays. And there was a figure coming for the World Bank, which was quoted time and again, that when it comes to humanitarian action, $1 US, World Bank still US dollars, $1 US invested in prevention helped sparing $16 if there was the need to deal with the consequences of a crisis which would not have been correctly or efficiently prevented. It is about that. As I said earlier, the Commission has proposed a big amount of money, but what will be the impact of that money will depend, of course, on the shape of the legal basis, which will now be discussed with the Council and the European Parliament. But money, as we always say, is not the the amount of the money that matters. It's the way it is spent and the priorities that it will support. So the question is, will there be a willingness to invest in prevention, which, by the way, is absolutely essential in terms of health security? Because what does that mean? It means stockpiling. Investing huge money in stockpiling medicines. That's exactly what the ERA is doing for the time being. But medicines that could, at the end of the day, never be used at all. We all remember the 6 million of masks that were destroyed first a couple of months before the COVID outbreak in our country. So it's a difficult balance to be made by government and the EU, even if the money is there.
Many thanks. And maybe just to start building on some of the points that that colleagues have raised. I like what you mentioned about the need to be the way we would like to approach disaster risk communication, and the need to some extent raise some sense of urgency in order to quick some actions, because that was exactly some sort of communication, some sort of discussion that we had with ECHO colleagues around the field of disaster risk communication. And actually we attended that workshop exactly with the answer that I prepared for this question. So I'll unfold that for you and for our audience. Something that we mentioned is to the need to be very assertive. Be very assertive means that, of course, we need to be aware about the risks, but we also need to be aware about the capabilities that we have to respond to that risk and cope. How do you achieve that? With two key things that are much more easier said than done. First is create specific understanding of fluent institutions that are adequately funded, that are fluent on what is to be done, under which means, and with actors. We call it end-to-end protocols, and that includes, for instance, understanding who can reach to which audience, understanding and doing adequate risk assessment. For instance, again, raising one of the examples from the Spanish Red Cross in the flash floods in Valencia, one of the elements that was considered in the lessons learned was the fact that the population that was affected in the river basin was basically older adults with problems of mobility. That should have been known by the authorities at the time and the actors around to do preemptive evacuations, because they were a population that was definitely exposed to a higher level of vulnerability. They couldn't go to the first floor by the time the alert was given. This granularity and this understanding of your of your population, the agency that you have and the possibilities that you have at your disposal is essential to gain something that we keep hearing in the discussions, that is trust. Mm-hmm. Trust is not a one-off action that you're going to gain out of a communication strategy. It's something that a population is going to give you by the time you're there before, during, and after hazard strike, and that you need to prove to your society that you're also accountable to them and you have the possibility to replenish and scale up in terms of operations. So there is two elements: institutional preparedness that is fluent, and also this local engagement that not only happens by the time you need something from them to act, but that has been there also before, so that there is a certain degree of bilateral horizontal relations. We're mentioning how we could respond to stockpiling and to public health emergencies, and you mentioned ERA. And the medical countermeasures, that, by the way, is also putting a strategy out there. By the time we're collecting evidences through our national society, Red Cross national societies, they mentioned the importance of also community-based discussions to be very assertive, give actionable steps, and also to make sure that rumors do not spread. This information is also something that is affecting. We call it to some extent hybrid threats. We have been in operations in other parts of the world facing that, and it's a matter of making sure that you know where to find trustful information and who is the channel and the actor and the communicator that can give it best. So maybe just to conclude and to go back to the 2 points, the importance of having We are as prepared as our society is. We are as resilient as our society is. We need more first aid training. We need more volunteers. We need more protocols. And we need to convert preparedness into a day-to-day conversation, not necessarily from fear and not necessarily from the need to trigger immediate action, but from an awareness, understanding that it might be that we are a community, that we need to, for some situations, we might be attending older adults, but for some others, we also need to prepare an emergency. So just make sure that there is a trusted and principled discussion and conversation with the communities you're aiming to attend.
I am particularly grateful that we got to the end of the 3 rounds of questions with a reference to Jean-Claude Van Damme. I was quite concerned that this would not happen in today's seminar. From trust to building narratives around strategic autonomy and now preparedness, to this aspect of fear and whether or not it leads to preparedness. I think this is quite rich, and I would like to, having heard each other speak and intervene on different points, to give each of you about 1 to 2 minutes for some final reactions on your own views, I guess, beyond the bounds of my questions about this preparedness union, this strategy, and what exactly we're preparing for.
I would like just to go back to question of what the union can do. Jean-Louis has said, and I totally agree with you, that the union can do what the member states will allow the union do. But this is due to the allocation of competences between the member states of the European Union. This is due to the prerogatives of member states in the context of security. We have a provision in the treaties saying that national security stays with the member states. It's a exclusive competence of member states. So clearly there is a, let's say, a sovereign prerogative for them, making more difficult for the union, of course, as an autonomous subject to be able to deploy instruments and tools. Actually, the union was capable to do that. And of course, because of an exceptional scenario such as COVID-19, it was an emergency for all the member states. And now we have instruments that have been modified in light of lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. The UCPM has been modified. The cross-border health emergencies instrument has been modified after COVID-19. We have an instrument for the internal market. Now we have instruments in the digital dimension. Cyber Solidarity Act, for instance, which is in a way copy-pasting some solutions from the UCPM, from the Union Civil Protection Mechanism. So this is to say that now we have in place instruments that are trying to give the Union some margin of maneuver. And of course, the other part that has to be taken into consideration is that, in a way, one of the success of the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, which is probably one of the most important instruments that the Union has adopted in trying to face disaster scenarios, was that it was based on a voluntary coordination among the member states. So member states were not obliged to participate in the mechanism to give assistance, but there was a voluntary harmonization, and there was a financial conditionality mechanism. And the Union can try to let's say, to exploit these instruments, these avenues, to try to trigger voluntary harmonization mechanisms at the level of the member states. If you don't oblige them to do something, but you really, in a way, recommend them to do something, and you can give financial assistance to the states in order to mobilize assets, in order to buy or to rent assets, well, this is something that can help the states, the state communities, the state public opinions, but at the same time, it's helping the Union to be prepared. So this is to say that, yes, the Union can do what the states decide the Union can do. This is the golden rule of this game. as the principle of conferral. But there are strategies, there are instruments that can be used by the Union in order to improve its course of action. So I would like to conclude my talk with this positive perspective, even though I'm quite pragmatic, so I see all the obstacles we have.
Yes, I'm going to try to follow in the same logic. I think that the Union should not, and when I say the Union, I'm mainly referring to the Commission for the time being, because I mean we're still waiting for the opinion of the European Parliament or the Council. The Commission should not try to move faster than what the member state would like it to move. Indeed, it can consolidate its role by showing support when asked by member states to show support. I was listening very carefully to what you said, and it was brilliant. You quoted a series of very successful examples, but all of them were at national, let alone regional level, and could have taken place without any kind of EU support. So it illustrates that indeed, I mean, and I come back to what I said earlier about the delivery gap, the Union should not oversell its capacity to influence member states' action in terms of preparedness. It can support them, it will support them, but not moving faster than what they would like it to move. Now, this being said, in the very, very long term, I mean, evolution can take place. And after having quoted Jean-Claude Van Damme, I will take another example, which is dear to some of the people in this room. Take migration and asylum policies, for instance. More than 30 years ago, they were not even on the agenda of the EU. It took the Maastricht Treaty and some external shocks, like, for instance, the so-called waves of refugees fleeing the consequences of the civil war in ex-Yugoslavia, to make member states think, and some of them were more advanced than others, that some kind of cooperation could be needed in an EU, well, that was not the EU at the time, in an institutional framework that could improve the response to these challenges. So something like that could appear in the future. And we are not stuck with the issue for once and for all with the issue of legal basis, competences, and so on and so forth. But this will be member states driven. And I would like to add one last thing, because we are allowed to comment on each other. Okay, I understand what you say, but I still think that the fear factor is a key element. Even if, I mean, it might not be something to be feared in the immediate future, but it might have to do with the history of the community you live in. I take an example from my experience in humanitarian aid. We sponsored a fantastic community-led program of earthquake prevention and disaster risk mitigation in Guatemala City. Mm-hmm. Why was that successful? Because Guatemala City had been completely destroyed, almost completely destroyed, flattened by earthquake in its past history. So there was in the DNA of the community some kind of remembrance that, yes, indeed, that risk was there with us. It was not an immediate fear, but it helped to build that at community level. So I think that we can have a very long debate, an interesting debate about that. I want to simply to say that when the fear factor is not there, it's going to be more difficult.
Yeah. Many thanks. I'll finish both of the panels of my intervention a little bit doing or attempting to do a recap, and starting by stating how the EU is perceived and how it should evolve into something a little bit more concrete. The EU, the way we see it, is fading away a little bit of the interpretation of the prescriptive interpretation of the treaties, and is going more into how it navigates the bits and pieces of competences that it has under certain themes, let's say, civil protection, health, and something that is very interesting and came up as crisis management. And we interpreted it as a hint towards how we could start preempting some competence in terms of security, because it falls in a context in which, of course, we are less and less talking about the rule of law and more talking about spheres of influence triggered by one very big figure in the geopolitical situation that we're having at the moment. But it's also very interesting how, while we're fading away from this, we're also going closer to specific interpretation and operationalization of clauses, such as the mutual defense clause and the solidarity clause, and the way that intertwines with other international organizations such as NATO that is exactly touching upon this topic. So it's on the one hand is becoming very creative, revisiting some clauses and trying to interpret them so that they are positive and optimistic towards more action. On the other hand, it's also coming back to the very raw clauses that were left in a drawer and then all of a sudden might come in as very practical. Now, in terms of what it should start and what it should start implementing is something that, and again, I'm going to refer to Arantxa González-Laya. She's the Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs and has been involved in Spanish politics for a long time. And she mentioned something that is called the politics of inevitability. So it's a fact that we feel that the race is lost before we even start running. This is something that it's still a little bit between this narrative of urgency to start doing something and become a little bit more of the agenda setter. And by doing something, you also need the buy-in not only from different states, and you need, again, specific big figures that are right now having opposite positions in the EU landscape, but also from the population. If the population start doing strong protests, I mean, Farmers might prove us wrong when we say that the citizens' mobilization do something very, very specific. But I would like to raise the importance that we all are part of the society. We, to some extent, we all have something to say. And by the time there is we're moving forward in terms of preparedness, we need to have a focus on a people-centered approach and start the logic from this and going higher up. We can have, as we said, further conversations on how the principle of subsidiarity take place and how we can make it into practice, but just not to lose focus on how, at the end of the day, the end part of the discussion is how our citizens are protected, how our communities are protected in a principled and efficient way. And this is something that sometimes is forgotten in the hallways of Brussels and in specific capitals when having this discussion.
I really thank you. And namely, I particularly like the fact that we end on this note of we will go as far as states allow us, but also as far as we can actually communicate to our communities and our citizens. So a bit of this bottom-up grassroots approach, so which transitions well into a conversation with a broader audience, including that online. If you have questions online, feel free to just signal it to us and introduce yourself and ask your question. I will start with those on site. Are there any questions for this rather lively panel?
Hello, I'm Simone. I'm a student here at St. Louis, EU Studies. And basically you said that everything that drives the preparedness is fear, okay? But you have the fear because someone already experiments the events, okay? For example, of course, if it rains a lot, there is a floating situation or other stuff, but how can you prepare about events that depend about crazy people? About the crazy people. So you cannot be prepared because you don't know if they want to conquer a country or want to bomb another one, or, you know. So how can you prepare this situation that don't depend on fear because no one never expects this thing?
Okay, two things. I usually, yes, indeed. This one.
Have two mics.
Okay. This one does not work. Okay. Okay. Well, I don't want to be misunderstood, even though I'm largely guilty for that. I'm not saying that fear is everywhere and is the basis of anything that looks like a preparedness strategy. I simply say that we should not underestimate the impact of fear. That's what I said. So it's not, I was not referring to any kind of causal sequence between fear and preparedness. Now, what you refer to is what foresighters called the black swan. And there, it's not a matter of preparedness, it's a matter of contingency planning. When I was in charge of emergency operation, including in humanitarian area within the Commission, I always asked, but they never did it, my colleagues to work on one exercise, which is still, situation which is still absolutely possible today. A bunch of terrorists do hijack a cargo flight. Very easy to do, because if you go to the other side of the Zaventem airport, you have the Melsbroek cargo airport, and it's very striking to see how easily you can approach the planes there. So one of these planes, one of these big jumbo jet, which is used as a cargo, is hijacked. And they crash it on a nuclear plant at the border between France and Luxembourg and Belgium. That is contingency planning. Are you ready to deal with the consequences of that situation? That is exactly, so it is, I would not refer to what you could have in mind, nuclear bombs on the Grand Place de Bruxelles, right, okay? But let's take that as an example. And that is the responsibility of the services, either the Red Cross or the civil protection where it still exists. That is their responsibility to have contingency plans susceptible to be unfolded in any of these situations. The example I take, yes, indeed, the one and only way to deal with this crisis would be, and there comes indeed an illustration of what the EU dimension could bring in, that is to say, good communication system between all member states affected. If you look, for instance, I was not at the Commission there, but you are too young to remember the consequences of the Chernobyl nuclear plant explosion. That was, completely surreal. People were referring to a nuclear cloud that was floating above a certain number of countries in the EU. Nobody knew where this nuclear cloud was exactly going to. Okay, that is another example of a situation where contingency planning would have been needed and when an EU dimension in terms of coordination would have been welcomed. But this is not about preparedness, it is about contingency planning. You cannot be prepared for each and every possible risk, even the most unforeseeable one.
Maybe just to compliment, because there is something that I liked about this question, and is the fact that it becomes overly cumbersome and complicated to start pre-identifying the different scenarios that you might be confronted with. But there is something that is important, and in different listening to different analysts, they do have a point, is the fact that right now we're preparing for the risks that we know, but we cannot prepare for what we don't know. With the consequences of extreme weather events, climate change, rising temperatures, we might be relying on certain infrastructure that might not be working under these conditions. So the fact that there is also an understanding of not only the risks, but also make sure that regardless of what happens, these are the basic things that you need to do. That was exactly a point that the EU was putting forth and was highlighting by the time it came out with the 72-hour self-reliance guidance. And that there is a certain point on that. The thing is that there also, depending on the emergency that you're facing, there are certain provisions and certain legal frameworks, again, relying on IHL, that should be considered. But I like the fact that, what I take for your question is the fact that risks do have there is a need to better understand risks, not only what we know or what we can be, according to our standards and our experience, prepared for, but also the ones that might be coming, and how ultimately, at the end of the day, is a very simple prescriptive question such as understanding that there is water, where are all the shelters, and who are the different organizations that could be at your disposal for support, not only for basic items and basic response, but also for something that in case of conflict becomes very interesting, that is link or relying again on finding your family in case of a conflict or a situation of chaos. That is something that the International Committee of the Red Cross does. So not only understanding, maybe not necessarily understanding all different possibilities, but whatever happens, what are the things that are going to be important and fundamental for the society, which is your family, water, and certain degree of identification, and how you can rely on this in order to be better prepared.
There is a starting this roundtable made reference to the first sentence of a State of the Union speech that Ursula von der Leyen gave last September. Europe is in a fight. Then, of course, this sentence was a bit elaborated, making reference to all the possible threats you can imagine, starting from Russia's aggression against Ukraine. This is to say that, we are already surrounded by risks and by threats that can scare us in a way. Fear is everywhere if you want, according to this kind of narrative, according to this kind of strategy. And these may produce other risks in illegal terms. If you start saying that we are living in a constant time of emergency, well, you are setting aside the ordinary rule of law system, and you are introducing emergency legal instruments that for sure will undermine some safeguards, some institutional safeguards, but also some rights and freedoms of individuals. This is a huge risk if we only speak about threats, hybrid threats, risk surrounding us. So we must also be prepared to elaborate, I would say, a less extraordinary legal setting in order to be able to protect our fundamentals. This is something that from a constitutional law perspective we should take into consideration. And there is also another element to be considered. If we start saying that we are surrounded by threats, everything can be a risk, well, this means, and everything is a security matter, it's something related to security, this means that nothing is, let's say, really relevant in security terms. If everything is relevant in security terms, everything becomes irrelevant. You are not able to identify priorities for your security. So this is why it's super important, I agree with you, that we are able to identify properly the risks in order to elaborate strategies, but also policy actions. Instead of, let's say, speaking about a general fight that we are in a way living in this era, in this time.
We also have a question online that I would like to give space for Tristan, I believe.
Oh.
Hi, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm calling in from Sweden, but I'm Tristan at the Stockholm Environment Institute in Lund University. I have a question that sometimes is left out of this conversation. My question is regarding EU-NATO strategic coordination on resilience and preparedness. So how would you describe the quality and coherence of EU-NATO cooperation on this? And is it a good fit between the EU Preparedness Union Strategy and the NATO resilience baseline requirements? Because in the Preparedness Union Strategy, it does mention deeper EU-NATO cooperation, but also if you're a member state like Belgium, Germany, or Sweden, both the EU and NATO member, you have two distinct but complementary frameworks that you kind of have to fit in between while also designing your own understanding of national preparedness and resilience. So I was wondering if you had any ideas on how cohesive this is, or is it kind of still fragmented? Sorry to make it a little bit more complicated on that end.
Thank you so much.
In all fairness, I don't know how far the cooperation is advanced. You're absolutely right to raise that point. It was absent from our conversation, and it's good that you remind us of this. When you talk to EU officials, they are optimistic about this cooperation. But okay, these are EU officials, and I don't know how deep that cooperation can be for the time being. In all fairness, I don't know. Am I right if I understand that one underlying concern behind your question is the issue that we have left also outside of our conversation, which is the civil-military coordination when it comes to preparedness and crisis management? This is, I think, one of the big issues the Commission is aware of. Well, by the way, I did always refer to the Commission myself, which is wrong, because the preparedness strategy is a joint strategy between the Commission and the European External Action Service, and we should bear that in mind. I know from inside that, there were tensions between the two branches in the process of drafting the communication, and that they had to find the right balance between these two, I would say, agendas, which should be seen as complementary. I've attended a couple of conversations about that, and again, please accept my apologies if I don't answer directly your question, because my direct answer would have been that I don't know. It's very interesting. When it is about civil-military cooperation, you see that from the military side, the view is clearly that the civil agenda should be coordinated with their ones, and that they should be the one setting the agenda when it comes to prevention and crisis management, and that civilian structures, whether they are civil society structure, and I would say Red Cross is amongst the civil society structure, or even public services like the Civil Defense Service, where they are independent from the Ministry of Defense, should fit in their overall framework. I see very little willingness, availability to look the other way around. That is to say, to look at ways the capacity of the military could be put at use when dealing with the consequences of a civilian crisis, like, for instance, major flooding, for instance, or a major earthquake. I see very little of that. I would like, by the way, to ask our colleague from Sweden on whether he has a view about this, because I really see that as one of the key strategic issue in the further implementation of the strategy.
If I can just add two things. The first one is a very legal one. So if you look at the treaties, in particular at the Treaty of the European Union, clearly the NATO umbrella takes precedence over the US, meaning that in theory, let's say the EU should elaborate its strategy without prejudice to the strategy elaborated at a NATO level. And actually, there are similarities, at least when it comes to, let's say, the reaction to hybrid threats. I mean, the notion of a hybrid threat is present in both organizations, and more or less it's the same. So there are no significant distinctions in this respect. But from a legal point of view, clearly there is, let's say, a precedence to be given to the NATO cooperation. Then, if I can add another short remark considering the role that the military dimension may have in civil-led actions, there is this idea that should be a last resort scenario. This is the idea. If you look at, let's say, the strategic instruments and also your secondary law, clearly it is said that military assets may be involved, but as a last resort scenario. Probably because, I mean, the idea behind is that military assets may also imply another kind of attitude vis-a-vis the emergency at stake. And probably what should be more elaborated in this strategy is exactly this point, the nexus, making probably possible another way of looking at the interaction between the two dimensions.
No, maybe very briefly, because I'm more a reaction to Federico rather than an answer to a question directly on how the military and civilian cooperation should be done, and how sometimes we might be thinking about military for the service of the civilians, not the other way around. Maybe as a reminder that, again, on sea protection systems, there is still, for instance, from my home country, Spain, we also have UME. You have the military units that are actually deployed for a non-conflict situation. So again, having a look at how that plays out in practice. And then a little bit more from the humanitarian perspective, and as humanitarian actors, again, we're talking, it's something that is very new to us, but the fact that you have a very, specifically in fragile context, we might be thinking twice if we want to be accompanied by a military or not by the time there is a crisis. So just to highlight the fact that, again, there is a conversation that needs to be think in terms of operations beyond competences and beyond funding. There is, at the end of the day, how that plays out by the time you're face to face to your neighbors.
Thanks for this operational note in particular. I would like to give first Tristan a bit because he was asked a question by the panel, so we kind of flipped the room here. Before giving the floor also to Nguyen, I believe, who also has a question for the panel. But Tristan.
Yeah, I'll keep it very simple. I'm actually an American hiding in Sweden, so I'm not an expert on the Swedish total defense system. But I know that it's quite unique within that civil-military cooperation component, and that within total defense, depending on the context, whether it's crisis or war, civilian structures are kind of like supposed to be complementary with military priorities. So if, like, let's say you have an event in the Baltics, like Sweden is a NATO host country, so civilian assets and infrastructure and stuff have to be able to complement with that. But I would say like that civil military question is getting stronger around Europe, mainly not necessarily just because of the war in Ukraine, but also the nature of climate disasters is overwhelming a lot of civil protection agencies and groups. So some are having to rely on militaries for both like responding to some of these disasters. So I think it's kind of an open question that each country within their national disaster laws has to decide how to work on that component. But like you said, it's kind of like with the preparedness, everybody has to customize it and buy in the way they want to. But yeah, hopefully I answered that a little bit.
Thanks for contributing to the discussion. I would like to now give the floor. I believe Nguyen had a question.
Yes, can you hear me? Michael Nguyen speaking.
Yeah.
Loud and clear? I'm working for the EU military staff, so we are in fact also on top of the game when it comes to discussion about preparedness, readiness and resilience. We always see the three words in one hand, and I just wanted to add to the earlier discussion that yes, the military are there, but in contradiction with the past, since our armies have been smaller than it used to be, at this point with the Preparedness Union Strategy, people need to be aware, in fact, of the fact that we will rely more also on the civilians. Just to give you an idea, when it comes to logistics, there are numbers going around that estimate that about 90% of logistic support would come from the civilian part. So yes, the military are there, but we are now also discussing the whole spectrum. And I added in the group chat that we are looking also with the Preparedness Union Strategy up to the point of armed aggression. So this also means that all the things that we are trying to do with the Preparedness Union Strategy is also to create that extra room for the military in order to operate when an armed aggression would come to our territory. So I'm a little more optimistic when it comes to the things we are doing. It was mentioned, we have to create a new crisis management culture, which has been lost over the decades. And I think with the events that we have had over the last year, looking to drones which are blocking our airports, looking to cables that are cut undersea, that the general perspective from the public is that yes, something needs to be done. And of course, they are looking first of all to their own authorities. And the EU is in fact looking especially, and it was mentioned, when it comes to cross-sectoral challenges, to be more effective, but also when it comes to cross-border actions. And there, of course, the legislation effort that we can offer from European perspective can be helpful. And there are two good examples that are currently ongoing. One was mentioned, and it is about COVID, and it's a good relationship that we currently have with NATO in order to be better when it comes to health and santé. And the other one is military mobility, which is a flagship project that is being worked upon and being developed further just in order to comply with what the Preparedness Union Strategy wants to do. So it's not a question, but just a fact. I was happy at the end that the NATO was also mentioned. So for those who didn't read the chat, be aware of the fact there is a structured dialogue on resilience between EU and NATO, which takes place every 6 months, and where we as a military, in fact, exchange detailed information with our NATO colleagues who are working, of course, also on the same topic. And then referring to the national structures within the NATO, the national defense plans are now becoming an obligation, and therefore also implying the nations nationally to get better organized when it comes to crisis management. So all the blocks are there, and if we play it smart, then yes, the Preparedness Union Strategy can become of added value. But as the panel has rightly pointed out, in the discussions that we have had with the member states, when it comes to CIF-MIL cooperation, it becomes clear that the member states are in the driving seat and they have to be willing to share the information. But at the end of the day, when there is a crisis, what is of utmost importance, it is mentioned, get the right info, know who's responsible to react, and decide what the priority is and who will be supported and who will be supporting. And if you can already achieve that goal without going into any details, then you have achieved your political goal. So far my intervention. I hope this helps to get a broader understanding from our perspective. Up to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for this perspective. I would like to, because we are reaching the end of our roundtable, unfortunately, I perhaps would like to, if there are no pressing questions from the audience, give the panel, let's say, a final word on what was heard from the audience on site and online and your particular perspective. I think that there's a common thread that keeps coming back, which is ultimately we'll go as far as states allow us, and states, namely when it comes to civilian military cooperation, are definitely in the riding seat. I would love to hear your final thoughts on this. Thank you.
Well, true, but we are in an integrated legal order, meaning that states, in a way, are still member states. So they have also to act according to their membership duties under EU law. Meaning that in a way there is also an idea of mutual membership that should inspire their action. Of course, let's say there is another problem which is related to the way in which states participate at this stage, this time in the integration process. We know that there are some states that are acting undermining the integration, undermining the possibility for the Union to join and achieve goals and results. This is another element that should be taken into consideration in this story. So yes, for sure, member states have a big role in the picture, but please don't forget that there are duties, there are obligations for the states. And of course, there is also a court in Luxembourg that sometimes can introduce some, let's say, further obligations and duties for. Of course, this is not so relevant when it comes to an emergency, but again, I hope we are not only speaking about emergency times, we are also speaking about ordinary times where problems may occur.
Well, I would say that we should all, when it comes to the preparedness strategy, be on a kind of wait-and-see mode. It's fresh from the oven. It is maybe too broad, whole of society, whole of government. As you said, it's a very ambitious strategy and agenda. But it is now being translated. I would like to come back to my initial intervention into a legal proposal, which is the new EU CPM upgraded regulation. So let us see what comes out of that process. It's going to be a negotiation process between the Parliament and the Council. I mean, it's a full EU legislation. And we'll see also how much money is attached to that when the new multi-annual framework enters into force in 2028. I think that this will provide institutional answers to many of the questions that were raised today. And amongst other things, the division of the balance of power and capacities between the EU and the member states. In the meanwhile, the 2 years ahead of us should be used to prepare the ground by having workshops like this one or implementing a project like the one that you are running. By maybe, okay, we might, as Egmont, be supporting the organization of a conference by the Commission on this strategy later in the spring. So there is the time now to discuss all that and to have all this exchange of view so that when everything will fall into place, 2028, beginning of the next multi-annual financial framework, we could have a somewhat more settled agenda than the one that we have today.
Maybe just to conclude, I think we all can agree that as we mentioned, one of the positive points of the Preparedness Union Strategy was that triggered loads of conversation. So we can agree that it's very timely. We can agree that it involves us all. So it broke down a theoretical concept into something that is affecting us. You name it, citizens, different households, different parts of the community, but also the private sector that we have not covered during our conversation, but definitely plays a great role. At the end of the day, we need to be to consider that we need funding to put all of that into practice. We need to take into consideration not only the UCPM regulation that will be stated, but also how preparedness as such is phrased into the UCPM, into the multi-annual financial framework for 2028. So far it is 1 billion, if my memory serves me well, for the UNICEF 10 for the Union State Protection Mechanism, but then see how that unfolds into also population preparedness, public-private consultation, and many other partnerships that need to be taken into consideration. So at the end, all falls down to the fact that we cannot do it alone. We have specific legal frameworks that need to be referred to, not only about talking about the treaties, but also considering the, again, international humanitarian law, but just may be able to link all of this, to put all of this together and make sure that we have something that is practical and that is tangible and that is lasting.
Thank you so much. And I think this idea of lasting and tangible is a good one. Overall, I think as you all said and agreed on, there was one concrete point, is that the strategy has an added value, the fact that it opens a conversation. We're very grateful that you actually agreed to join this conversation. The strategy also, much like our Center of Excellence on EU emergencies, will last for 3 years to implement all these 63 activities. I'm not sure if we ourselves are going to implement 63, but again, I invite you to keep following our activities. And most importantly, thank you for joining this discussion. I would like to also invite you to give a round of applause to our speakers of here today.